All right, so our fourth unit in Psychology 101 is a unit on human development. We're going to look at the biological side of things and how that affects psychology. We're also going to look at the environmental side. The big debate that people always turn to when they're looking at human development is this idea of nature versus nurture. And nature versus nurture, what comes from your genetics, right? That natural part of you really don't have a whole lot of choice or control over, and what part comes from the environment in which you were raised. And so when nature calls, we got to go, right? Genes are the nurture part, or the nature part, excuse me, of this little equation. And so you've all got genes inside of you, things that your genes can determine, things like your eye color, unless you get those cool contacts, your adult height, your body build, your hair color, unless you get some hair dye, that sort of stuff. But your natural things come from your genetics, right? That those things are going to come together. Now you get half of your genes from mama and half from dad. And so every cell in the body has 23 pairs or 46 chromosomes, except for reproductive cells. Sperm and egg have 23. And so when sperm and egg unite, you get that little picture that's down there at the bottom, and that is a zygote. Yes, you all started out as little zygotes. And so that is half mom and half dad. So half of your genetic code gets passed along to the other person in the mix with the reproduction of the child, and you get what's called your genotype. Now, the difference can be genotype says, well, this is what your genes are. You also have to work with those things. You know, LeBron James had an awful lot of genetics that said this guy could be a fantastic basketball player. But if he never picked up a ball or didn't work very hard at doing it, he wouldn't be obviously as successful as he ended up being. There are some different periods of time that we go through. The germinal period, you got that little zygote starts to split, and as it splits one time and another time, you get stem cells, cells that aren't anything yet, but that are starting to grow. Inside a woman's uterus. We enter the embryonic period, weeks 3 to 8 of a pregnancy, where you're going to look a little more kind of like the little tadpole looking thing down there in that left-hand picture. And then the child becomes what we call a fetus. And so from month 2 to month 9, that fetus is growing, and you've got all of the organs for the kid that are developing during that point in time. Now, if we stack up a human child versus different children from the animal kingdom, what we see is that human children develop more slowly. We have the longest period of attachment to our parents of anybody in the animal kingdom. I remember being a kid, and my grandparents lived on a dairy farm. And my grandmother waking me up one day to go out and watch a cow being born. And it was disgusting. I had no idea why in the world she would drag me out of bed to watch that, but it was like the miracle of life kind of thing. But I remember being amazed when that calf came out very quickly. It's up and moving and walking around, trotting around. And you look and think, most of us don't take our first steps until we're about a year old. We're definitely helpless for a lot of those early years. So I got a little chimpanzee in a diaper here for you. Isn't that a cute picture? And what happens is a lot of times psychologists will put humans up against chimps because chimps have about 98% of our genetic code. Now you look at the little guy here and you figure out that that 2% probably somewhere in there is a hairy gene, right? And so some of those guys you've seen at the ballpark, things like that, they may just be like 1.5% off. Who knows? But developmental rates are different for different species. And so if you put a human baby next to a chimpanzee baby, the human child will progress more slowly for those first 2 years. Now, eventually, they'll start to outpace, obviously, the chimpanzee, but in that early period, they are developing more slowly. And so we have the longest period of attachment. Elephants have a really long period of attachment. Kind of cool stories if you're interested in looking at how that works. But because of that, our parents, that initial, the controllers of that initial environment, play a big part in our early development. By about the age of 8, 95% of your brain structure is set. That doesn't mean you know everything that you're going to know, obviously, but that means the mechanisms are going to be there. But your body structure is less than 50%, and your reproductive structure is only 10% fixed up by the time you're 8 years old. Obviously, got a lot of growing and maturing to do during that period of time. One of the things that we know is that there are times where a child's brain is just geared to learn something. And it's a process that psychologists refer to as imprinting. And basically, that's when a baby's brain is ready to receive that. There can be some different things. Smiling is one of them. There's a great episode of Friends, the television show from the 90s, where Chandler and Monica are getting married. They're taking an engagement photo, and it turns out that Chandler doesn't know how to smile in pictures. Um, that is kind of a funny way of illustrating something here. If a child doesn't get smiled at during this imprinting period, they don't learn that. Uh, there's an imprinting period for the language. If you know there was a pharaoh back in ancient Egypt that took some kids and locked them away, never let them hear spoken language, and he thought they would spontaneously start to speak Phoenician, which was the language of the Egyptians. And once they figured out the kids weren't going to do that, they tried to catch the kids up, and they never caught up. That period of time had passed for them. Learning a foreign language is that way. It's one of the things we do kind of backwards here in the United States. We actually start you out a little too old on those foreign languages. There are a lot of countries where they do that a little sooner, and it's a little more critical. So this is imprinting. Not this. This is that weird Twilight book movie series, right? And I don't even want to know what the imprinting was here. So imprinting is this, not this. Um, the maturity process is an automatic process as well. And so it's kind of a sequential process of development that everybody goes through. You just go through it at different times. For young ladies, a lot of times it can be menstruation showing up. Uh, but in a lot of us, as we start to go from children to adults, you get hair in your armpits, things like that, that are a symbol that your body is starting to mature. Um, that like I said, it happens different in different ways for different people, but everybody's getting just kind of to the same place. One group that psychologists really like to look at are twins, and there are two types of twins. There's what are called monozygotic, right? Remember that word from the beginning, zygote. That is the cell where the sperm and egg have gotten together. Monozygotic means there's one cell. And so that cell, the first time it splits in two. And so we call those uh, identical twins. Those kids are going to have exactly the same genetic code. And so um, those genes are going to be exactly the same. Any differences in those kids are going to come from the environment. It's a great movie from the 60s called The Parent Trap. Lindsay Lohan, I think, redid in the late 90s and early 2000s. You might have seen that, where you have two identical twins who were separated at birth and lived in different places. And so when they met at summer camp, they had different accents, um, different interests in sports and hobbies and things like that. But they were identical twins. A lot more common are what are called dizygotic twins. And dizygotic twins are more common Today, because of things like in vitro fertilization, and in vitro fertilization is obviously, when people can't get pregnant naturally, they will harvest eggs and sperm, and then they take those and they implant those in mama and hope they take hold, and the lady can get pregnant. Well, a lot of times they'll just do one egg; they'll do several, and so it becomes more common that um, you get multiple kids. Dizygotic twins are as genetically related as any other set of siblings, so they're not identical. My little sister's 2.5 years younger than I am. We would not be any genetically more different than a dizygotic set of twins. And so usually what happens there, and this is a type that'll run in families, actually most types of multiples will run in families, um, but this is one where a woman's ovaries will release a couple of eggs um, in during that particular month instead of just one, and both eggs or three eggs, however many it is, end up getting fertilized at the same time. So we're going to take a look next at genetics and kind of where all this stuff is going to come in, and what really the emphasis on this uh, nature side of things, what that's going to contribute to these folks in a psychological sense.